Imagine standing on the edge of a 1,000-foot precipice. Behind you stands a man who speaks no words. He simply lazily raises a finger and points into the void. What do you do? A normal person would recoil in terror. But these warriors did not just jump, they smiled as they fell to their deaths. There were no screams, no fear, only pure, insane ecstasy. This is the story of the most dangerous sect in history, where a human life was worth less than a snap of the fingers, and murder was the only ticket to a paradise that was actually built of plywood and forbidden substances. The awakening did not feel like a return to the waking world from the embrace of sleep, but rather like a violent, glorious resurrection into a realm where the very concept of suffering had been excised from existence. The young man, whose body only yesterday had been a roadmap of open wheels from the disciplinarian's whip and whose stomach had gnawed at his spine from the hollow ache of starvation, opened his eyes expecting the crushing weight of the barrack's soot-stained ceiling and the biting cold of the Persian dawn. Instead, his gaze was swallowed by a sky of such impossible, vibrant azure that it seemed to vibrate with an inner light, adorned with clouds the color of bruised peaches and spun gold that drifted with a languid, hypnotic slowness. The air that filled his lungs was not the thin, freezing atmosphere of the high mountains, sharp with the smell of horse manure and unwashed wool, but a heavy, intoxicating vapor saturated with scents that had no business existing together, the heady sweetness of blooming jasmine, the deep, animalistic warmth of musk, and a cloying, sugary aroma that bypassed the nose to strike directly at the brain, slowing the pulse and wrapping the mind in a blanket of warm velvet. He found himself reclining not on straw infested with lice, but on vast, billowing cushions of Chinese silk so frictionless and cool that they felt like woven water against his skin, supporting his limbs with a tenderness he had never known in his short, brutal life. Around him, the laws of the mortal world seemed to have been suspended and replaced by the architecture of dreams. The silence of their high peaks was gone, replaced by the melodic, rhythmic splashing of liquid, but these were no ordinary mountain springs. To his left, a canal carved from white marble ran with a thick, opaque whiteness, the scent of fresh, rich milk rising from it. To his right, a second channel shimmered with the golden, viscous slow-motion flow of pure honey, catching the sunlight like molten amber. And directly before him, flowing with a scandalous, terrifying abundance, was a stream of deep, ruby-red wine, a substance strictly forbidden by the mullahs in the world of men, yet here it flowed freely, a testament to a higher law where prohibition had been transmuted into reward. The young man lay paralyzed, not by chains, but by a catastrophic sense of awe, his mind struggling to bridge the gap between the purgatory of the fortress barracks and this sudden, inexplicable ecstasy. He raised a hand, half expecting his own fingers to dissolve into mist, convinced that this was a hallucination born of a dying brain, but his fingertips brushed against something warm, solid, and impossibly soft. A figure knelt beside him, a creature that could not possibly be a daughter of Eve, for her skin possessed a luminescence that seemed to capture and hold the ambient light, and her eyes were vast, dark pools that promised an eternity of understanding. She did not speak with the harsh, guttural tones of the village women he had known, but smiled with a benevolence that unraveled the last knots of his anxiety, lifting a jeweled goblet filled with the crimson liquid to his cracked, parched lips. As he drank, the taste was an explosion of spices and warmth that raced through his veins, flushing away the memory of cold stone floors and the fear of the whip, replacing it with a humming, vibrating sense of invincibility. Other figures appeared in the periphery of his vision, equally ethereal, moving with a grace that defied gravity, their laughter sounding like silver bells chiming in a soft wind, attending to his every unspoken need before he could even form the thought. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. leaving him breathless and weeping silent tears of overwhelming gratitude. He was dead. The grueling training, the hunger, the cold nights on the ramparts of Alamat, it had all been a test, a brief flicker of suffering to weigh his soul, and he had evidently passed. He had crossed the final threshold, leaving the dusty, painful earth behind to enter the promised gardens of Jannah, where the wine leaves no hangover and the pleasure has no consequence. The drug-laced air and the potent vintage conspired to sever his tether to logic, and he surrendered completely to the illusion, letting the artificial paradise swallow him whole. He looked at his hands, clean of dirt and blood, and saw not the hands of a soldier or an assassin, but the hands of a chosen saint, a beloved of the Creator, who had been plucked from the mud and elevated to a throne of eternal bliss, unaware that the architect of this heaven was not God, but a man watching from the shadows of a very earthly tower. Time ceased to have any meaning within the walled sanctuary, dissolving into a singular, fluid moment of rapture that felt less like the passing of hours and more like the unraveling of eternity. The sun that hung above the garden did not seem to track across the sky in the usual manner of the mortal realm. Instead, it bathed the lush greenery in a perpetual, golden twilight that never deepened into the frightening dark of night nor bleached into the harsh glare of noon. The young man existed in a state of suspended animation, adrift in a warm current of pleasure where the boundaries between his own body and the world around him began to blur and finally disintegrate. This dissolution was aided by the small, pungent balls of emerald green paste that the beautiful attendants placed upon his tongue at regular intervals, washing them down with the ruby wine that tasted of summer and forgetfulness. The substance was bitter for a fleeting second, a sharp earthy tang of resin and concentrated herbs, but as it dissolved, it unlocked doors in his mind that he had not known existed, flooding his consciousness with a euphoria so potent it felt like liquid sunlight poured directly into his veins. Under its influence, the world was reborn, the colors of the flowers screamed with vibrancy, the red of the roses and the purple of the irises vibrating with such intensity that they seemed to hum, and the sound of the water in the fountains transformed into a complex, orchestral symphony that he could feel resonating in the marrow of his bones. In this drug-induced haze, his memory was systematically scrubbed clean, the jagged edges of his past filed down until they were smooth and featureless. The face of his mother, worn by wind and worry, faded into the mist. The sensation of the icy wind biting through his threadbare tunic on the castle ramparts was replaced by the phantom memory of a warmth that had always been there. The concept of suffering became an alien language he could no longer speak or understand. The maidens who tended to him, creatures of impossible grace with skin like polished alabaster and eyes like dark honey, were the architects of his new identity. They did not merely serve him, they worshipped him. As they bathed his feet in basins of rosewater and massaged his limbs with oils scented with sandalwood and amber, they whispered a constant, hypnotic liturgy into his ears. They told him in melodic, sing-song voices that he was the chosen one, the beloved of the Creator, a soul so pure that he had been plucked from the filth of the dunya and elevated to his rightful throne amongst the blessed. These whispers, fueled by the hashish and the wine, took root in his pliable mind, growing into a towering tree of unshakable conviction. He was no longer a peasant soldier, he was a prince of the spirit, and this garden was his birthright. It was amidst this swirl of sensory overload and ego dissolution that the master of the illusion would make his appearance, stepping into the garden not as a man, but as a manifestation of divine will. Hassan I-Sabr did not walk, he seemed to materialize from the light itself, clad in robes of such blinding whiteness that they hurt the eyes, standing in stark, austere contrast to the riot of color that filled the oasis. To the drugged and adoring gaze of the young Fedayeen, this was not the old man of the mountain, the political strategist and warlord who commanded a network of spies and killers. This was the gatekeeper, the Ridwan of Paradise, the only being in the universe who held the power to grant or withhold this eternal bliss. When the Master's shadow fell across him, the young man did not feel fear, but a surge of ecstatic devotion so intense it bordered on agony. He saw the face of Hassan not as the visage of an aging scholar with a beard turning to grey, but as a countenance of terrible, beautiful light, the face of the one who had unlocked the chains of the material world. The young man would weep openly at the sight of him, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, filled with a desperate, frantic desire to prostrate himself and offer up his very life as a token of gratitude. He watched the white-clad figure with the eyes of a starving dog watching its master, understanding with a bone-deep certainty that his entire existence, his past, his present, and his future, belonged solely to this man. One word from those lips could extinguish the sun or make the stars dance, and the boy knew, with the clarity of the fanatic, that he would tear his own chest open with his bare hands if this supreme being merely hinted that it would please him. The indoctrination was complete, the drug had opened the door, the pleasure had ushered him through, but it was the image of Hassan I-Saber that locked the gate behind him, sealing his fate as a weapon forged in the fires of a false heaven. The collision with reality did not come as a slow, groggy awakening, but as a brutal, bone-shattering impact, as if he had been hurled from the highest cloud directly onto a bed of granite. The young man gasped, his lungs seizing as they tried to draw in air that was no longer sweet with the perfume of eternal blossoms, but thick with the suffocating, damp stench of mildew, old straw, and the sour reek of unwashed bodies crammed into a confined space. He lay shivering violently on a floor of cold, rough-hewn stone, the merciless chill seeping instantly through his thin tunic to bite at his flesh, a stark and cruel contrast to the warm, silk-draped cushions that had cradled him only moments, or perhaps centuries, before. The darkness that surrounded him was not the velvet, star-dusted twilight of the garden, but a heavy, oppressive gloom, broken only by the grey, sickly light filtering through a high, barred window that looked out onto nothing but jagged rock and empty sky. The rivers of milk and honey had evaporated, the ruby wine had dried upon his tongue, leaving behind only the taste of bitter ash and bile, and the beautiful maidens who had whispered promises of eternity had dissolved into the shadows, leaving him utterly, devastatingly alone in the cold. A primal scream tore from his throat, a raw sound of pure loss that echoed mockingly off the damp walls of the dungeon, sounding less like a human cry and more like the wail of a damned soul realizing the gates of hell had just swung shut behind him. He scrambled on his hands and knees, ignoring the pain as the rough stone flayed the skin from his shins, clawing at the masonry until his fingernails cracked and bled, searching for a hidden door, a latch, a seam in the reality that would let him slip back into the bliss he had just lost. But the walls of Alamet were solid, built from the bones of the mountain itself, indifferent to his agony and deaf to his pleas. The fortress, perched like a vulture's nest high above the world, held him in a grip of iron, its sheer drop-offs and towering ramparts acting as the bars of a cage designed to keep its prisoners from ever tasting freedom again. The physical withdrawal from the drugged wine and the hashish paste hit him a moment later, a wave of nausea and cramping pain that twisted his stomach and sent tremors through his limbs, but this physical suffering was nothing compared to the metaphysical amputation he had just endured. He had seen the face of God, he had walked in the courtyards of the afterlife, and now, for some unknown sin, he had been cast down, expelled from the sanctuary and vomited back into the grey, colourless purgatory of the material world. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he realized with a jolt of horror that he was not the only exile in this pit of despair. Around him, huddled in the corners or pacing the small cell like caged tigers, were others, young men he recognized from the training grounds, but changed, hollowed out, as if the fire of their souls had been extinguished. They looked at him with eyes that were wide circles of madness, swimming with tears that would not stop falling, mirroring his own incomprehensible grief. They were a brotherhood of the fallen, shadows of men who had tasted the divine nectar and were now starving to death with bellies full of bread, because no earthly food could ever satisfy the hunger that had been awakened in them. They grabbed at him, their hands cold and clammy, asking him in frantic, hushed whispers if he had seen the garden too, if he had tasted the wine, desperate for confirmation that their memories were not merely the delusions of fever. Together, they huddled in the freezing dark, weeping for the loss of a light that was more real to them than the stone under their feet, consumed by a singular, burning obsession that eclipsed all reason. The fear of death had been surgically removed from their minds, replaced by a far more terrifying fear, the terror of never returning to the side of the master who held the keys to their joy. In the crushing silence of the fortress, broke only by the howling of the wind outside, the young man understood that he was no longer his own person, he was a hollow vessel, an arrow resting on a bowstring, waiting to be loosed at any target, provided the flight path led him back home. When the heavy iron-bound doors of the barracks finally groaned open, admitting the blinding, harsh light of the midday sun, the broken young men were herded out into the central courtyard of Alamet not by the lashes of whips, but by a force far more compelling, the desperate, magnetic pull of their own spiritual starvation. They stumbled into the open air, blinking against the glare, a wretched assembly of trembling limbs and hollow eyes, looking less like elite warriors and more like addicts in the final throes of withdrawal. They fell to their knees in the dust, pressing their foreheads against the cold flagstones, for standing before them on a raised dais, framed by the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Alborz Mountains, was the architect of their joy and the author of their despair. Hassan-I Saber, the old man of the mountain, looked down upon them with an expression of serene, terrifying detachment, his white beard fluttering in the mountain wind like a banner of truce, though there was no peace to be found in his gaze. To the weeping initiates, he was not merely a political leader or a religious scholar, he was the living conduit to the divine, the only being in existence who possessed the authority to reopen the gates of the paradise from which they had been so cruelly exiled. He did not speak to them of strategy, nor did he bore them with the intricate theological debates that consumed the scholars in Baghdad. Instead, he spoke directly to the gaping void in their chests, addressing the memory of the wine and the touch of the houris that still haunted their skin. With a voice that carried across the courtyard without the need to be raised, slicing through the howling wind, he explained the nature of their fall. He told them that their expulsion from the garden was not a permanent damnation, but a necessary test, a tempering of the steel before it could be forged into a weapon worthy of God's hand. The garden was still there, he assured them, its fountains flowing and its maidens waiting in sorrow for their return, but the key to re-entering that realm of eternal bliss was not prayer or meditation, but absolute, unquestioning obedience to his will. He explained that their bodies were merely temporary vessels, heavy clay shells that anchored them to this world of dust and pain, and that true liberation lay in their willingness to discard these shells at a moment's notice. To prove the absolute power he held over the boundary between life and death, and to demonstrate the triviality of mortal existence compared to the rewards that awaited the faithful, the master turned his gaze slowly toward the highest rampart of the fortress, a dizzying perch that jutted out over a vertical drop of thousands of feet into the rocky gorge below. Standing there, rigid as a statue against the blue sky, was a sentinel, a young Fedayeen who had stood guard for hours without moving, a man who had clearly passed the test that the trembling initiates were now facing. Hassan-I Saber did not shout a command, he merely raised a single, withered finger and made a slight, dismissive gesture, a flick of the wrist as casual as one might use to brush away a fly. The reaction was instantaneous and horrifying in its lack of hesitation. The sentinel did not look down at the abyss that yawned beneath him, nor did he flinch or ask for a moment to say a final prayer. Instead, a look of transcendent, beatific joy washed over his face, a smile of pure ecstasy that was visible even from the courtyard below. He saluted his master with a fluid grace and then simply stepped forward into the empty air. There was no scream, no flailing of limbs, no desperate attempt to grab at the edge of the wall. He fell with the silence of a stone, plummeting down the sheer face of the cliff, his white robes billowing for a brief second like the wings of a dove before he became a speck that vanished into the shadows of the ravine. The sound of his body impacting the rocks far below did not reach them, swallowed by the distance and the wind, but the silence that followed in the courtyard was deafening. The young protagonist, kneeling in the dirt, watched the empty space where the sentinel had stood a moment before, and to his own shock, he felt no horror, no revulsion, and no pity for the shattered life at the bottom of the gorge. Instead, a green, venomous envy coiled around his heart, squeezing it until he could barely breathe. He was jealous. He was consumed by a burning jealousy of the dead man, for he understood with a crystalline clarity that the sentinel was not dead in the way that mattered. He had been released. He had paid the toll and was, at this very second, waking up on the silk cushions, the taste of the ruby wine already on his lips, the arms of the beloved wrapping around him. The lesson had been carved into the boy's soul with a chisel of trauma. His life was nothing more than a currency, a coin of flesh and blood that had no value until it was spent to purchase his return home. He looked up at the old man of the mountain, his eyes dry and burning with a fanatical fire, and silently begged for the chance to be the next one to step off the ledge, to throw away the burden of existence and fly back to the garden that called to him from beyond the veil of death. The command, when it finally fell from the lips of the old man of the mountain, was terrifying in its simplicity and absolute in its authority, delivered with the casual indifference of a man ordering a servant to fetch water rather than sending a soul to its destruction. The young Fedayeen stood trembling in the inner sanctum of the fortress, his eyes fixed on the floor, as Hassan I-Saber handed him a singular object, a slender, curved dagger whose steel had been chemically darkened to avoid reflecting the moonlight, its tip coated in a viscous, gummy resin that smelled faintly of bitter almonds and death. He was told to descend from the eagle's nest of Alamet, to cross the burning wastes and the treacherous mountain passes, and to enter the great capital city where the Grand Vizier held court surrounded by a legion of elite Mamluk bodyguards. His mission was not merely to kill a man, it was to strike at the very heart of the Seljuk Empire, to perform a public execution that would freeze the blood of kings and emperors in their veins. He was to wait for the moment when the Vizier was most secure, most surrounded by his iron ring of protection, and then he was to end him. There was no mention of an escape plan, no map of safe houses, and no coin for a return journey, for both master and servant understood the unspoken covenant: the dagger was a one-way key. The assassination was not a crime to be fled from, but a transaction to be completed, the final payment required to purchase his reentry into the paradise from which he had been exiled. The journey to the capital passed in a fugue state, a blur of days and nights where the young assassin moved with the relentless, unthinking momentum of a sleepwalker. He barely ate, his body consuming its own reserves, and he slept only when exhaustion forced him to the ground, yet he felt neither hunger nor fatigue. His mind was entirely occupied by the vivid, hallucinatory replay of his time in the garden. The taste of the wine was a phantom sweetness on his cracked lips, and the scent of jasmine acted as a shield against the stench of the roadside caravanserais. When he finally walked through the towering gates of the city, he moved through the teeming crowds like a ghost, invisible not by magic, but by the sheer, vacuous emptiness of his presence. The merchants shouting their wares, the beggars pleading for copper, the soldiers marching in formation, to him, they were the dead ones, walking corpses trapped in a grey, meaningless purgatory of dust and struggle, while he was a traveler from a higher plane, merely passing through their shadows on his way home. He felt a profound, pitying detachment from the vibrant life around him, for he carried the secret of the universe tucked inside his sash, pressed cold and hard against his ribs. On the appointed day, the public square was a heaving ocean of humanity, a cacophony of noise and color where the Grand Vizier had come to distribute alms to the poor, a calculated display of piety and power. The target sat upon a raised platform draped in cloth of gold, a man of immense girth and presence, his fingers dripping with rings, laughing as he tossed silver dirhams to the scrambling masses. Surrounding him was a wall of steel, 100 elite guards, giants in chainmail with hands resting on the hilts of their scimitars, their eyes scanning the crowd for the slightest hint of danger. A rational man would have seen an impenetrable fortress of flesh and iron. A man who valued his life would have turned and fled. But the Fedayeen did not value his life, he viewed it as a burden to be shed. He moved toward the platform not with the furtive, nervous energy of an assassin, but with the calm, purposeful stride of a pilgrim approaching a shrine. The guards, trained to spot fear, guilt, and hesitation, looked right past him, for his face held none of these things, it held only a serene, beatific smile, the expression of a lover rushing to meet his beloved. He slipped through the perimeter with the fluidity of oil, exploiting a momentary gap as the crowd surged forward for the coins, and before a single sword could be drawn, he was on the platform. The vizier turned, his smile fading into confusion, but he saw only a blur of motion. The strike was surgical, practiced 1,000 times in the dark. The poisoned blade buried itself to the hilt in the side of the great man's neck, severing the artery and silencing his laughter forever. Hot, bright blood sprayed across the assassin's face, blinding him for a moment, but he did not recoil. The smell of the blood triggered a synaptic misfire in his drug-ravaged brain, and for a split second, it smelled like the heavy musk of the garden's wine. Chaos erupted instantly, a roar of horror from the crowd, the shriek of metal as 100 swords were drawn, the heavy thud of boots rushing toward him. Yet, the assassin did not run. He did not raise his weapon to defend himself. He simply stood over his fallen prey, dropped the dagger into the dust, and raised his arms to the sky, his eyes wide and shining with tears of joy. He looked past the descending blades of the guards, past the screaming mob, and saw the clouds parting to reveal the golden light of the afterlife. He was ready. The ticket had been punched, the price had been paid, and he closed his eyes, waiting for the soft hands of the houris to catch him before his body even hit the ground. The heavy steel of the Mamluk guard's scimitar descended with the force of a falling guillotine, cleaving through the turban and shattering the bone of the assassin's skull in a spray of red mist. The young Fedayeen did not flinch, he welcomed the impact as the knock on the door of eternity, the final shedding of the heavy clay shell he had been taught to despise. Darkness swallowed him instantly, a velvet curtain dropping over the chaos of the public square, blotting out the screaming crowd and the spray of the vizier's blood. He waited, suspended in the nanoseconds of fading consciousness, for the scent of jasmine to replace the copper tang of death, for the soft, cool hands of the maidens to lift him from the dust, and for the blinding white light of the Creator to warm his face. He reached out with his soul, desperate to grasp the hem of the Master's robe, expecting the rush of the opium wine and the eternal peace he had purchased with murder. But the light did not come. The music of the spheres did not play. There was no river of wine, no golden throne, no smiling Ridwan waiting with open arms to usher him into the presence of God. There was only a cold, crushing silence, a vast and indifferent void where his soul, stripped of its comforting lies, disintegrated into the absolute nothingness of biological cessation. The great cosmic joke was delivered in the silence. There was no bridge, no return ticket, and no paradise waiting on the other side of the blade. There was only the rotting meat of a corpse left to feed the stray dogs of the capital, his sacrifice unrecorded by the heavens, his faith betrayed by the brutal, final physics of death. Hundreds of miles away, high in the jagged peaks of the Alborz Mountains where the air was thin and razor-sharp, a carrier pigeon fluttered into the roost of the eagle's nest. Their message was small, a scrap of parchment tied to a bird's leg with a thread of silk, but it carried the weight of an empire's fear. Hassan Saber, the old man of the mountain, sat in his austere chambers, reading the brief report with the dispassionate gaze of an accountant tallying a ledger. The vizier was dead. The dagger was broken. The transaction was complete. He did not smile, he did not offer a prayer for the soul of the boy who had just thrown his life into the abyss on a command. To him, the boy was not a martyr or a saint, he was a projectile, an arrow that had been fired and spent, a tool that had served its singular purpose and was now discarded without a second thought. The chessboard of the Seljuk Empire had been rearranged, a powerful enemy removed, and the cost was merely one expendable life, a price so low it was almost insulting to the value of the victory. With a weary sigh, born not of guilt but of the tedium of administration, the master rang a small silver bell, summoning his head eunuch. The order was given in a low, bored monotone. It was time to reload the weapon. Deep within the fortress, behind the locked iron gates that guarded the fake paradise, the illusion was being dismantled and reset with the grim, sweaty efficiency of a theater backstage after the final curtain. The divine houris, whom the dead boy had believed to be angels woven from light and musk, slumped against the marble walls, wiping the thick kohl from their eyes and the rouge from their cheeks with trembling hands. They were not celestial beings, they were terrified peasant girls, kidnapped from the surrounding valleys, forced to play the role of divine lovers under the constant, looming threat of the executioner's blade. They stripped off their fine silks, shivering in the mountain chill, washing away the sweat of their performance, their eyes dull with the exhaustion of maintaining the fantasy for the madmen who were pushed into their arms. Gardeners moved through the artificial twilight, hastily digging up wilted flowers and replacing them with fresh blooms brought up from the greenhouses, masking the smell of stagnation with heavy clouds of incense. The rivers of milk and honey, which were nothing more than white-colored water and thickened syrup pumped through hidden clay pipes, were drained and refilled, the hydraulic mechanisms oiled to ensure the flow remained silent and magical. The drug-laced wine was brewed in great copper vats, the hashish paste rolled into potent spheres, ready to steal the minds of the next batch of victims. The machinery of the cult ground on, a monstrous industrial complex designed to manufacture martyrs out of lies. In the dark, freezing cells below the garden, a new group of young boys, hungry and broken, stirred in their sleep, dreaming of a salvation that was being constructed from plywood, paint, and chemicals just a few hundred feet above their heads. They did not know that their prayers were directed at a man who viewed them as livestock, nor did they know that the heaven they longed for was a stage set built over a pit of bones. Their cycle was a perfect, self-sustaining circle of blood and deceit, turning endlessly in the dark heart of the mountain, proving that the most dangerous weapon in the world was not a poison dagger, but a belief system weaponized by a man who believed in nothing but power.